Hello, and welcome to today's event on ancient geopolitics. We are thrilled to be able to welcome Dr. Samuel Ottewill-Soulsby of the University of Oslo, who's going to be talking with us today about geopolitics in the early medieval world. And so without further ado, I'll let him go ahead and begin speaking. And I've invited him to speak for as long as he likes, about whatever he likes, and then we'll have a bit of discussion and eventually open it up for questions from the audience. And just to note, for anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, please do so via the Q&A tab, which you'll find on most screens at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you type your question in there, I'll be sure to feed it onto our speaker when we come to the Q&A. So go ahead.
Well, fabulous. Thank you so much. And inviting me to speak for as long as I like is always a fairly dangerous, proposition, as I've been known to go on at quite some length. But I'll try to keep it sort of relatively snappy today. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be speaking to you today. It's always wonderful to have a chance to talk about my work, but I'm particularly excited by this opportunity to be part of the Ancient Geopolitics project. That's because I work on international relations in a period when a lot of people don't think international relations existed, which is the early Middle Ages. This is the period from after the end of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century down to about the 11th century, although exactly where we bring the period to an end sort of, depends on exactly which intellectual tradition you're part of. But broadly, it includes things like Justinian's Byzantium, the Arab conquests, more on which I'm sure later, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. It's perhaps better known as the Dark Ages, a phrase I've come to dislike because I think it obscures more than it reveals. I think people hear it and assume that nothing of interest took place in the period. It conveys an impression of irrational violence and superstition, which would be incompatible with international relations. And I've frequently been told to stop using the term international relations in connection with the period at all. And the reasons for this differ, but normally I find that they come from a combination of people not understanding the early medieval world, while also holding it to a much higher standard than they do the modern world. So, for example, sometimes I'm told that I shouldn't talk about international relations because there was no such thing as a nation or a state in my period. I would dispute both of those claims. The sources from the period make frequent reference to groups defined as nations by common descent and a shared language and laws. Likewise, if the Abbasid Caliphate or England at the end of the 10th century are not states, then I'm skeptical that anything was before about the 18th century. But I'd also observe that modern specialists frequently talk about international relations between entities that are not nations or states, such as the European Union or Al-Qaeda. Other times I'm told that international relations require long-term foreign strategies, devised and executed by professionals. And here I can't help thinking that the last 10 years should have disabused us of any notion that anyone in any foreign office knows what they're doing, never mind has a long-term plan. All of which is a very long-winded way of saying that I'm thrilled to be here and to have a chance to place the early medieval period in the same context as other pre-modern geopolitics. The rest of the session should involve me going on slightly fewer rants, but I think this might be useful for explaining where I'm coming from and why I take the approach that I do. I think that in order to understand pre-modern diplomacy, we need to think about the practical realities of the period, as well as the ideas that shaped and guided the people involved. Much of our discussion today will involve exploring a world that may feel very strange indeed. But throughout, I'm going to be making comparisons to the present day because I think it matters. I don't want the early Middle Ages to be hived off as this strange, primitive period of hairy people with antisocial tendencies. Doing so makes it harder for us to understand the past, but also makes it more difficult to learn any potential lessons that may otherwise come to us. And I do apologize, my next door neighbor appears to have started now is the moment to start doing some drilling. So I'm going to relocate to a hopefully slightly quieter location. But so this is a fascinating period featuring a wide range of different people's faiths and forms, and forms of political organization. I think we get a huge amount from thinking about international relations in this period. So my work in particular focuses on relations between the Carolingian Empire and the Islamic world, and I'll talk a bit more about the specifics of that in a bit. But I think before I get there, it may be worth sort of saying a few words about the things that make the international relations in the early medieval period distinctive. And some of those are features that that it shares with all pre-modern periods. So we'll be familiar with specialists in the ancient world. So these are things like, for example, difficulties with communications. The fact that getting a message takes a very, very long time and relies something involving ships or four-legged transport or good old-fashioned walking, with implications for how fast you can get a message, how up to date you can be, and the sheer level of detailed knowledge and intelligence you can have. Other things that of course come into play here is that there are no permanent ambassadors in this period. So you're always sending a person off, depending how far away the people you're talking to are. They may you may be sending off someone for multiple years until they get back. And again, this has an impact on the nature of international relations, and depending on who you're doing business with, you may not be have the same level of up-to-date information or rapid forms of communication. Some other things, though, are perhaps a little more specific to the early medieval world. One of the things that's characteristic about this period is that a lot of our political entities are actually quite large. This is most obvious with things like the Islamic Caliphate, which at its height stretches from Spain to the west to modern Pakistan in the east. But even even in places like Europe, when we look at entities such as the Frankish Empire, the Byzantine Empire, we're often actually looking at political entities that are geographically large, but perhaps not necessarily administratively dense. And that in itself leads to political structures which are both large in scale, but often fairly heterogeneous in their interior. Intellectually, we're talking about a world that's very much in conversation with the ancient past, and that, most obviously, perhaps for those in the European tradition, we're talking about empires that are very much in the shadow of ancient Rome. In particular, the Carolingian Empire is one which has a large number of people reading ancient Roman texts, thinking about the ancient Roman past. That's something that most obviously comes out with Charlemagne's imperial coronation in 800, when he's crowned as the first emperor in the West since the 5th century. But it manifests in lots of other ways as well. But we see that similar shadow of the past elsewhere, most obviously in the legacy of Rome's great rival, the Persian Empire, which has its own impact on the Islamic world and beyond. And their traditions of diplomacy, their traditions of power and communication are very much present in the early medieval world and shape ideas of diplomacy and international relations. And perhaps most obviously for someone thinking about diplomacy between the Christian West and the Islamic world, we also have to think about the impact of faith as something that has, that's as, if not distinctive to the early medieval world, it's very much relevant to periods before and after. Nonetheless, can have a distinctive flavour here in shaping the way that people think about international relations, in shaping the way in which people think about who they can deal with, how they deal with them, and what kind of traditions they work with in that tendency. But moving perhaps though to my work more directly, the relations that I work on emerged from two revolutions that took place in the middle of the 8th century. The first was the Abbasid Revolution of 750. This took place in the Caliphate, the great Islamic empire forged by the Arab conquests of the 7th century. These conquests had dramatically opened the Mediterranean, bringing new peoples and languages and a new faith to them. Under the Umayyad caliphs, it was very much an expansionist empire. But the Umayyads didn't rule unopposed, and in 750 they were overthrown by a new dynasty, the Abbasids. And this fundamentally broke the unity of the Islamic worlds. And over the next few decades, we see a large number of new actors emerging in North Africa, such as the Idrisids and the Aghlabids. But perhaps most importantly for me, a scion of the Umayyad dynasty escaped to Spain and set up a new independent polity in Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, based in Cordoba. So the result is a multipolar Islamic world, but one that, as I mentioned, increasingly draws upon Persian culture. The other revolution comes the following year in 751, when Pippin the Short made himself king of the Franks, overthrowing the last Merovingian king. The Franks had emerged during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in what is now France, Belgium. Pippin was a member of the Carolingian dynasty, which had been the power behind the Merovingian throne for the last couple of generations, in a manner perhaps analogous to the Japanese shogun and emperor. On one level, this revolution might not seem to be a big change, but Pippin and his son Charlemagne would fundamentally change Europe. Most obviously, they would conquer quite a lot of it, creating an empire that stretched from Brittany and Barcelona in the west to the Danish border in the north and Rome to the south. But the more subtle change comes in the form of internal reforms. The Carolingians were determined to create a Christian empire filled with pious worshippers following one standard liturgy. Their quest to do this properly also led them to embrace the classical past, albeit with some reservations. Indeed, most of the ancient Latin works we have that survive today, but survive because they were copied by the Carolingians. And on the face of it, there might seem to be quite a lot of reasons why these two worlds wouldn't talk to each other very much. The Abbasid caliphs were based in Baghdad in Iraq. Charlemagne's capital was Aachen, in the very westernmost part of what's now Germany. As I mentioned, in a pre-modern world with all its communication problems, there's that distance can be a very real issue. And we also have the potential for a lot of language difficulties with two very different languages of business, Latin and Arabic, as well as very different cultural expectations. These are also worlds that really clashed. So famously, Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, fought a Muslim invasion at the Battle of Tours. Equally famously, Charlemagne launched Muslim Spain in 778 that ended disastrously with the ambush of Rolands by the Basques in Roncesvalles. Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, conquered Barcelona in 801 after a long siege, and yet diplomacy happens. Most celebrated is that between Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid, he of the 1001 Nights fame, who dispatched envoys to each other, culminating in the caliph sending the emperor an elephant, Abu Labas, who arrived in 802. We have quite a lot of diplomatic missions between the Carolingians and the Umayyads of Al-Andalus. We even have contact between Charlemagne and North Africa. And in addition to talking to other monarchs, both the Carolingians and the Umayyads were in touch with a range of rebels and other figures within each other's territories. And so the question of why all these different polities are get in touch with each other is a question that a lot of scholars have tried to answer, basically for as long as we've known that these relations happened. And I think the most popular idea that this is all part of a grand alliance system. The theory goes here that the Carolingians and the Abbasids both had enemies in common. The Umayyads of Al-Andalus were a problem for both because they attacked the Franks regularly, while their ruling dynasty was a potential challenger to Abbasid legitimacy. Both the Franks and the Caliphates were also often at war with Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. And the result is an alliance system similar to the one we see in Europe before the First World War, with Aachen and Baghdad in league against Cordoba and Constantinople. It's a nice idea, and one that's quite appealing because it sounds really rational and allows you to draw out really pretty maps, but the timing doesn't really work. The Umayyads and the Abbasids were not a threat to each other. Both had much bigger things to worry about, and neither could really effectively hurt each other. The Abbasids were struggling to control Tunisia, never mind Spain, while the Umayyads didn't really have a fleet and faced the prospect either of a march through hostile territory or of a really, really long swim. The Carolingians may have had their differences with Constantinople, but they were not going to help a Muslim power conquer Byzantium, sometimes something the Abbasids themselves were not particularly interested in doing. And so the alliance system doesn't really work. Another idea, which I think has a little bit more to it, is the idea that this diplomacy happened because Charlemagne was really interested in the well-being of Christians within the Islamic worlds. Conversion to Islam happened slowly, so the majority of the population of the caliphate was still Christian at this time. And I think this does have something going for it. Charlemagne and his successors gave money to these Christian communities in Spain, North Africa, and the Holy Land. And there was a lot of contact in particular with the Patriarch of Jerusalem. We even have a Frankish attempt to catalogue all the religious institutions in the Holy Land that might need their financial support. Here again, though, I don't think the timing works. The contact with the Patriarch began after Charlemagne got in touch with Harun al-Rashid. And I think this is Christian communities within the Islamic world seeing an opportunity to piggyback on an existing conversation. So why then do I think that this diplomacy happened? And I think here it's important to distinguish between what was going on between the Franks and Al-Andalus and what was going on between the Franks and the Abbasids. The former is what I like to call frontier diplomacy. So here we have two great powers, the Carolingians and the Umayyads, who shared a long and unstable border by the Pyrenees. The two powers were quite aggressive to each other. Neither was strong enough to conquer the other outright, but both could do each other a lot of damage by raiding and attacking. The Carolingians are quite interested in taking territory. The Umayyads are looking for booty and glory from waging war on a non-Muslim opponents. And it's a kind of curious irony, I think, that war creates a lot of negotiation. The conflicts between the Franks and Al-Andalus led to things like truces and treaties. Both sides had prisoners they had to ransom. Both often had difficulties elsewhere, which made it necessary to seek a ceasefire or guarantee of peace. The very real possibility of war makes diplomacy more, not less important. Adding to the complication was the presence of a large number of powerful political actors on the border, and these are men embedded on the frontier of both faiths and many ethnicities, including Franks, Goths, Basques, Arabs, and Berbers, who were willing to cross the frontier and cut deals with their opposite numbers over the border or with the monarch of those territories. I tend to think of something of like, there's also something akin to the Great Game between Russia and Britain in the 19th century, with two great powers shadowboxing at each other while attempting to manage an unstable and shifting mix of proxies, clients, and allies. And the result is quite a lot of talking and negotiation, as both the Carolingians and the Umayyads attempted to get the upper hand over the other. And this is very different, I think, between what we see between the Carolingians and the Caliphate. And that's, which is certainly not a relationship born out of potential conflicts, if only because Aachen and Baghdad are quite a long way from each other. I think the clue here actually comes from our sources. So, for example, we have a biography of Charlemagne written by his courtier Einhard. And Einhard tells us that Charlemagne contacted Harun who wanted an elephant. And we can maybe pause here to admire the barefaced cheek that Charlemagne displays here by effectively cold calling one of the most powerful men in the world to ask him for an elephant. But then again, it did work, which, and I kind of suspect there may be a life lesson there somewhere. But why did it work? Well, another clue here comes from our one Arabic source that talks about this contact. A Syrian apocalypse identifies Harun al-Rashid by the gifts he received from the Franks. And I think a lot of scholars have tried to look past the gifts to the real business while complaining that our sources are all about gifts. And I think our sources are actually helping us here, because they're telling us that the gifts are actually what's important. So, and this is something I've been calling prestige diplomacy. Both Charlemagne and Harun came from political cultures that prized gifts from distant lands as tokens of respect and honor from foreign rulers. The Abbasid court was filled with stories of Persian kings who received tribute from the entire world. And both rulers are in a position where they kind of need a prestige boost, sort of about now. When he asked for an elephant in 797, Charlemagne was approaching the most ambitious part of his reign. He was rolling out a series of reforms that dramatically intensified the nature of Frankish governments, demanding much greater investment from the subjects, particularly elite laymen. We're just a few years off him being crowned emperor, once again raising the stakes. And in this context, he needed to convince the powerful in his empire they were part of something special. And contact with Harun al-Rashid does that very nicely. And for his part, Harun al-Rashid is also in a similar moment. So just at the point that he replies to Charlemagne, he breaks with his previous chief advisors, the powerful Barmakid family, upturning the political order in his administration. He also makes an extremely controversial arrangement for his succession. And in order to sell these changes, the Caliph does a number of things, including leading the Hajj to Mecca. But I think receiving and sending diplomats with distant rulers is also a useful way of conveying that. And so what I'm saying is that this diplomacy was primarily intended to impress a domestic audience. And this might seem like a slightly strange state of affairs. We might want to think here about rancor and the primacy of foreign policy. The idea that the need to compete with external powers dictates domestic policy. But if we think about it, we can see this sort of behavior in our own modern world. Politicians are keen to be photographed holding important meetings with other world leaders. Even better is something that suggests a special connection with someone like the US president or the Pope. This prestige builds status within the domestic sphere, allowing the leader in question to be perceived as a statesman on the world stage. Perhaps the oddest thing when viewed from the presence is the elephant in the room, the literal elephant in the room, Abu Abbas. Elephants were not native to the lands Harun al-Rashid ruled. They also couldn't be bred in the caliphate. They're thus very rare, and he probably didn't have many. Abu Abbas was almost certainly an Asian elephant, almost certainly born in India, and had already made a pretty epic journey to Iraq before he traveled to Charlemagne. For Harun, being able to dispose of such an animal was a mark of his power and generosity. For Charlemagne, the elephant elevated into a new status. We know that Abu Abbas was a huge hit because decades after his death in 810, people were recalling the crown's. And this might seem charmingly quaint and medieval, but something like this is still practiced today in the form of the famous Chinese panda diplomacy, which I suspect my host is very familiar with. So when Richard Nixon visited China in 1972, Mao agreed to send 2 giant pandas to America. Further pandas were given to the UK and Mexico, although since 1984, Beijing only loans out pandas. Pandas are iconic animals that are obviously associated with China, making them the perfect tool of soft power for the Chinese government, being prestigious and valued by the recipients. This gives us some of the context for understanding what both Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid are trying to achieve here with this elephant. And on that note, I think I've been talking for quite a long time, and I'm certain, and it's and it may be time to let someone else get a word in.
Sure. No, this is absolutely fascinating and incredibly interesting. So let me just start with a really basic sort of small bore question, which is, what did Charlemagne send to Harun al-Rashid?
That is an excellent and slightly mysterious question. So the boring answer is that we have quite a fun letter that he sent to the Bishop of Salzburg, effectively saying the Caliph likes precious metals. Get me all the gold and silver you can lay your hands on. Which sure, it feels a little bit like getting a gift card, I guess. But yeah, sure. And there's also a hint that they sent linen and very, very fine cloth. Although given that Iraq is a bit of a center for textiles, that may be a little bit cold to Newcastle. The fun story is that Charlemagne sent very fierce hunting dogs to Harun al-Rashid, and sadly, the source for that comes about 80 years later in a slightly unreliable collection of fun stories, but in which the point of the gag is that Harun ends up thinking that Charlemagne must be a really amazing hunter because he's got these fabulous dogs, when the story just preceding this, we've just seen Charlemagne land flat on his face while attempting to hunt an aurochs.
Yeah, so I'm just curious about that, because in the sense that there's this exotic animal that arrives in Aachen, and that really is very important for prestige, but then what could he possibly have reciprocated with? Like, what could he have sent to Baghdad that would have had a similar effect? I don't know, but yeah, precious metals seems like certainly a possibility.
The other thing which would be interesting is one of the things that people in the Caliphate really do associate with Franks and really do respect is are their weapons. So Frankish swords are known to be the best across Western Eurasia, and they do show up in the Islamic world. I think it's possible it'd be a little bit controversial, sort of selling these weapons. There's a lot of legislation passed against selling these weapons to Vikings for the obvious reason that said weapons then tend to get turned against you fairly quickly. But I could see those also being very treasured and very precious items.
Mm. Yeah, so the other question I have then is essentially we have a world or the subset of the world that these people were dealing in where there are four major powers, right? We have the Abbasid Caliphate, we have the Al-Andalus kingdom, we have the Franks, and then we have the Byzantine Empire, essentially as the four major powers. And a couple of things that struck me as interesting. So one was this idea that maybe Charlemagne is concerned with the welfare of Christians, or at least non-Muslims, in the Muslim world. And it also strikes me that this is before, about 250 years before both the Great Schism and the start of the Crusades, right? So on the one hand, it would make sense that he's, for example, is enjoying quite close relationships with Orthodox patriarchs, or what would become Orthodox patriarchs in the Eastern Mediterranean. But, how would those events later maybe undermine, or how would what Charlemagne is doing maybe prefigure or presage some of those events would be one question. The other little question is, what's between the eastern border of the Frankish Empire and the Byzantine Empire? Because I don't think Byzantium is controlling all of Central Europe. Right, so somewhere in what's now kind of Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, that whole region, Greece, I guess, is still Byzantine at that time, right? Would that all have been the Byzantine Empire, or are there other lands in between?
Oh, fabulous questions. I'll start with the prefiguring the Crusades, because the prefiguring the schism actually leads into the second question.
Mm.
So in terms of prefiguring the Crusades, there's one of the things I find fascinating about the later medieval legend of Charlemagne is the way he's adapted as in many ways the prefigure of the Crusader. And there's we know that people going on the Third Crusade, while on their way, are sing songs of Charlemagne fighting against the Saracen, and I think he's a very obvious touch point to go to, and to the extent that people in the Christians in Spain sort of later centuries fighting the Muslims occasionally complain that, well, if Charlemagne was so great at fighting Muslims, how come we're still having to fight them now? Charlemagne is most certainly not going on what we call a crusade, but I think there's something to be said for the idea of Carolingians waging holy war. There's you can there are so in the 9th century we see popes playing with the idea of that dying in battle against non-Christians is a guaranteed route to paradise, and those are ideas being sent to the Franks, and we can certainly see, in some of Charlemagne's correspondence with the Christians of Spain, for example, he complains about their bad behavior, so saying, previously I fought the Saracens in order to liberate you, but you're clearly a bunch of heretics, a bunch of no goods. I shouldn't have bothered. So I think these ideas are floating around, and I think a lot of Christians in Spain look to the Carolingians as potential liberators, and there's a lot of apocalyptic material circulating that has the Carolingians as figures who will move in and drive out the Muslims. So these ideas are circulating, but they're not. In many ways, I suspect that the distinction with the later Crusades is how much these ideas are based on the Carolingian court, whereas if we think of particularly the First Crusade, that's more of a medium scale operation being led by the great lords of France and Germany rather than necessarily by kings. But great question about schism, because tensions between different forms of Christianity have essentially as long a history as Christianity itself, and this is and the reign of Charlemagne sees a relatively major debate about the creed known as the Filioque controversy, which essentially pits the Carolingians again and the Latin tradition against what's happening in Constantinople. it doesn't help that the Carolingians don't have great Greek, and they sort of, and I think they slightly misunderstand the nature of what they're debating, but that's very much a tension that's at play. And one of the ways we might want to think about Charlemagne's relationship with, say, the Patriarch of Jerusalem is he's trying to move in on a relationship that traditionally has been the Emperor in Constantinople's in that role. But the really interesting question about what's in between the Carolingians and Byzantium. So there's quite a lot of interesting polities that start emerging in the 9th century. I think part of what's happening here is we have a competition between the Franks and the Byzantines over who's going to have influence in this area, and that helps sort of develop these nascent polities as they start playing Aachen off against Constantinople. So you have, for example, the developments of Croatia in the south, which very much is kind of, on the one hand, emerges from a Byzantine world, but on the other hand, very much turns to the Franks for cultural leadership, and there's a very interesting sort of balance there. But perhaps the biggest power, and this is the one that emerges in the middle of the 9th century, is the Moravian Empire, which centered on modern Moravia in the Eastern Czech Republic, which expands to really fill this space. And there's been some really terrific work in the last 30 years, primarily archaeologically based, these enormous sites there. And part of the reason that the princes of Moravia emerge is in that space between the Franks and the Byzantines. They're very much playing them off against each other, inviting missionaries from both the Latin and the Greek tradition. And it's in this context that Cyril and Methodius kind of appear from the Byzantine world. So there's a very fascinating way in which religion, politics, economics all interlocks here in providing a wiggle room for people like the Moravians to operate independently and indeed become effectively a great power in their own right.
Oh, this is really interesting as a general proposition. Another question that I would have is based on some of what you're just saying. What astounded me that I'd never really thought about is how much of the politics leading into the schism actually was due to the fact that the Franks didn't speak Greek very well, and so then if we think about these sort of language politics, which is another thing that then comes in later in international relations, often understudied, but this idea of whose language gets to be the international language or the language of record for all kinds of different things. But really, we seem to have at least three, for lack of a better term, linguae francae. In this case, that we've got we've got Latin, Greek, and Arabic all kind of competing with each other. And so one question I would have is, how much did people actually speak one another's languages? How much did the Franks actually know Greek, let alone Arabic, and how much did the Byzantines know Arabic or Latin, and how much would the Abbasids or the Al-Andalus rulers know either Latin or Greek?
And that's an excellent question, and it's one of those things where I think it helps if we think about different levels of language fluidity. So on the one hand, there's the Frankish court may have difficulties sort of mustering people who can really get into the subtleties of theology in Greek, but they've certainly got people who can cope with more straightforward Greek that you might get in a diplomatic letter. And in particular, one of the big advantages they have here is the fact that large chunks of Italy are in the empire, and the Carolingians have a very close relationship with the Pope. And these are all places where there are a lot of people with good Greek and need a lot of native Greek speakers who they can draw upon. I mean, but nonetheless, kind of the Franks are probably the least well equipped to do it. And there are Greek speakers in Aachen. There are quite possibly Arabic speakers in Aachen as well. There is one of the things they're drawing upon is a network of merchants who move across spaces. A lot of whom are Jewish. So we know, for example, there are Jewish merchants who routinely travel between the Frankish Spain and back. Many of whom are patronized by Carolingian rulers, and who presumably have at least some Arabic. but nonetheless, I think, compared to, so Constantinople, for example, has its own bureau of translators who answer sort of so the head of diplomacy. So they have people who can who can do this. Muslim Spain has the advantage of having a large Christian population for whom the priests at least are working in Latin, and there's we know for example that that some of these emirs are translating the letters they send to the Franks using one of the abbots in Cordoba. It goes badly wrong because it turns out this abbot is actually spying for the Franks and is passing on. But there's at least someone there are people with Latin in the room. And likewise, I mean, there are the Abbasid Caliphate can probably draw on people within the various Christian communities to help with translation. Although there's an interesting story, and I'm not entirely sure I believe it, about someone working in the Abbasid palace who was a Frank with Latin and Greek but no Arabic. And that's sort of and that they're called upon to translate. You end up at one point with a message being sent a couple of decades later, and this person translating the Latin into Greek, and then someone translating the Greek into Arabic. And it's great. I just thought, how do you function as in sort of in that environment without any Arabic? But maybe they could.
I mean, I've seen stranger things happen in the contemporary world. Even there's a lot of instances in diplomacy in the relatively recent past where something will go from language A into language B, which is often English or a similarly commonly used international language, and then into language C. So for example, as China was beginning to open relationships with a number of smaller states around the world, with which it hadn't had very extensive relations in the past, it would often use a third language as sort of either for direct communications or for translations between that country's language and Chinese, because there would be very few speakers in China of that country's language. If you think of, for example, some smaller countries in Europe, versus then in those countries, there'd be very few Chinese speakers who would be able to, but they might be able to use English or Russian or French or another language, so they would often do things like this. So it's not completely alien that there would be somebody doing that. I'm going to ask one more question that I'm really hoping that some people in the audience will add to the Q&A tab, because I haven't seen any come in yet. So I'm hoping to get more audience questions in as well. But the one other question I would have right now is, we think about diplomacy often and international relations generally as being driven by conceptions of national interest, right? So whoever is running the state in some way would have to define what the national interest is. And you've already kind of identified one aspect of it, which is domestic politics and prestige, which I think is hugely important. And actually, there's a number of scholars now looking at contemporary geopolitics and finding the same thing, right? A good friend and colleague of mine at the LSE, Rohan Mukherjee, has written a whole book basically about how it is that emerging great powers seek prestige and seek recognition as great powers, even in symbolic terms, as a primary goal of some of their foreign policy. But the question I would have then is, aside from this domestic politics and prestige, what would someone like, let's take Charlemagne first, what would he be defining as the national interest of the Frankish Empire? What's his goal in pursuing these relations with all the other players?
No, that is a great question. So I think so. If Charlemagne's sitting with his crown as a Frankish king, he's thinking about a couple of things. So thing number one is basic security. Like, are we being attacked? Who is attacking us? Who is a threat? How do I neutralize those threats? Secondly, I think there is a concept of honor or justice. So and we can see, for example, Frankish kings starting wars either because they believe that the honor of their people has been insulted by a neighbor, or alternatively because they think this area used to belong to us, that it no longer does is unjust, and therefore we have a just claim to that, and thus expanding Frankish power on those grounds. I think there's, well, at the same time, I think a lot of these ideas come forth through the idea of establishing security, establishing honor, and those things. But I think Charlemagne's also sitting with his hat as a Christian ruler, and that's where this gets slightly interesting. I sometimes sort of think that perhaps an analogy might be with the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, or something along those lines. He's and we've talked a little bit about some of the implications of that. It's trying to help Christians abroad, whether whether through diplomacy or financial gifts, but it's also about trying to bring together other Christian leaders. So, and when we look at a lot of his correspondence with other Christian rulers at the time, so Anglo-Saxon kings, for example, he's very much emphasizing, as fellow Christians, we need to be together as people. But finally, there's also an element of missionary activity, and this comes wrapped up with other things. But again, there's an idea of trying to bring sort of non-Christian rulers into the fold, again, I sort of which can sound very strange, but I always think in terms of, well, how does say Khrushchev looking at Latin America, or how would he approach this and this sort of thing, or that kind of the idea of there being a world out there that is sympathetic to you, which you need to expand ideologically.
Yeah, well, that's rather interesting. And we could imagine all of the different players sort of having a similar vision, right? That in the Byzantine sphere, this would be about preserving the legacy of the Roman Empire and restoring the glory of what was there several hundred years earlier. In Baghdad, I could imagine also them trying to say we want the unified caliphate, we want the sort of transformation of the whole world, and the rise of this sort of superior center of learning, culture, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
But the one I wonder about then is in Andalusia. What would be the framework there? I mean, they're under obvious threat in a sense, right? If it's about basic security, I would think, from a rather ignorant position, I would think that they would have the most imminent security challenge between two much larger hostile polities. But is that it, or do they have some other conception of national interest?
Absolutely, and I think so. So there's but although national interest is an interesting question here, because it's whether there's an Andalusian nation is a little bit harder to identify here, because the ruling dynasty identifies as being Arab. But after several generations of intermarriage, like most of the ruling dynasty are natural blondes with blue eyes, but they're still emphasizing their Arab parentage. Most of the population is Berber or Goth, or kind of that. And you get ethnic tensions and sort of what does it mean to be. So in many ways, and the binding glue here might be something like a shared Arabic culture, like a shared use of it, or a shared Islamic faith. Although again, the majority of the population for a long time are not Muslims. But I think in terms of the interest, we have security. But I think there's also an emphasis on the demonstration of piety, and that comes. And that comes out in a number of ways, through the building of mosques, the giving, charitable giving, but it also comes out in waging holy war on one's neighbors. And there's an interesting dynamic where, even when they're much more powerful than their neighbors, Al-Andalus is rarely trying to conquer per se. What they're instead trying to do is raid, take booty, take prisoners, but also communicate to the population that the holy war has been fought, and that's and which is again, it's that feels slightly strange from our perspective, but this idea of are people united by struggle in the cause of God.
Even though, as you pointed out a couple of times, the population in Spain at that time. I mean, there are very large Jewish and Christian
Absolutely.
communities there who are not immediately converting to Islam and never do, actually, in many cases. And Spain is famous later for all kinds of essentially ethnic cleansing and genocidal violence against both Muslims and Jews. Once it becomes fully a Christian polity. Were the Muslim rulers of Spain doing that as well at this time, or not really? If they're
Like
so
not,
involved in holy war abroad, are they involved domestically as well in suppressing other religions?
No, not really. And this is one of the things where we have to be a little bit careful. Because I think there's an image of Muslim Spain as this place of learning and tolerance where the three faiths sort of meld and to create something beautiful and wonderful. And it's not entirely false, right? This is a place of tolerance. This is a place where the different communities do touch, do communicate with each other, do engage with each other. But it's important to note that this is a policy which is very much built around the idea of Muslim dominance. You have to be a Muslim to hold senior office. If you are a Christian or a Jew, you must pay the jizya tax. And there are various ways in which your public profession of faith is limited. So no bells in churches, no new churches, no repairing. So these are often honored in the breach, as it were. But it's certainly a lot more tolerant than, say, the Carolingian, where Charlemagne is very much attempting to crack down on, apart from Jews, very much, very much attempting to crack down on faiths that are not Christianity. So there's tolerance up until a point, I suppose, is the way of thinking, but it's very much an unequal society.
Great. And we actually now do have a bunch of questions from the audience that have come in. One of them, which is really good, actually, that I'll start with, it's the first one that came in, says, how does the current geopolitical focus, current meaning I think today, on civilizations compared to the medieval era's approach to political identity and power? Were civilizations as such central to medieval discourse, or were factors like religion and empire more dominant?
Oh, that is an excellent question. So I think on one hand, sort of religion is a much more is at least on the surface a much more obvious sort of thing that emerges. Although I suspect to a certain extent a lot of our modern discourse about civilization also heavily emphasizes religion as well. When we think about the Islamic world, for example, or the Orthodox East, then that very much comes as well. But I think there is also very much an idea of civilizations put more broadly. And if for example you go to the Islamic world, there's very much a concept of there are a certain number of great kings or a certain number of great cultural areas. So which the Romans, so the Romans to the west, which may be Byzantium, but it also tends to include the Franks, China, India, the steppe peoples to the north, Ethiopia. These are kind of places that are thought of, even if they're not politically united, as cultural areas that can be recognized, which have their own unique characteristics. And there's an element of climate theory in play here as well. So these are being shaped by the climate they're in. So certainly that's certainly in the Islamic world, I'd say there is an idea of different civilization and of different types of civilization in play.
Yeah, I mean, could we almost think of these different religious / linguistic groupings as almost being like at least the way that people now talk about civilizations and international relations, which actually I think is quite problematic as such. I don't think it's quite fair to say, there are different civilizations in conflict with each other in the world. But if we sort of suspend that and say that's the way people are talking about civilizations, maybe there is something to these sort of linguistic religious groupings that resembles the kind of politics that people now ascribe to what they call civilizations?
And certainly, I think there's recognition that like within at least some cultural areas, it is easier sort of to do better, to get to communicate, and easier to do business, even if you're not necessarily the same within the same political entity, or the same or like you can move from one end of the Islamic world to the other, even if those different areas are actually in conflict with each other, and indeed are very much different flavors of Islam. I mean, but I think that also, however, comes there's of course the other flavor of that idea, which is less a collection of different civilizations, and more the idea of a civilized mission. So if you look at the Carolingian world, for example, there's often a great emphasis on the Carolingians often divide the world between sort of civilized peoples and uncivilized people. So one of the striking things about the Islamic world is that most of the time, when they look at the Islamic world, they see something that looks vaguely civilized. Whereas you look at Frankish descriptions of, say, Brittany, for example, or Scandinavia, and you often get something much more abusive, much more sort of akin to likening them to animals. And there's a kind of there's some interesting discussion about what does it mean to be human here? Kind of who is human and who is not quite human.
Well, that's really interesting as well. And yeah, the sense that the Vikings then wouldn't have been seen as civilized by the Franks, but
and it's but also, and of course, it's the challenge of political organization. Like one of the great really frustrating things from the Franks' perspective about working with Vikings is like there's often no king you can turn to. You can't turn to the king of the Danes and say, all right, how do we deal with these raids? You're dealing with one particular raiding party, you're dealing with one particular group, and even if they stick to the deal you've just made, the next group coming along will have nothing to do with them. I mean, one of my favorite things is a conversation about with missionaries in Scandinavia who encounter stories of dog-headed people, and there's a great debate about are these dog-headed people human? Like, they say, do we have to try to convert them? And actually, the decision is yes, because from their description, they live in villages together, they practice agriculture, they're clearly rational human beings, and therefore we need to bring the word of God to them. But it's an argument that's definitely happening about the peoples of Scandinavia.
Very, very interesting. Here's another interesting question, actually, that's it says, isn't this diplomacy just ritualized gift exchange between court elites, a bit like state visits are today, rather than serious discussions about trade, alliance building, conflict resolution, etc.? Not really modern diplomacy or geopolitics, in other words.
Oh, and that is an excellent question. So certainly, like, there are parts of this that look very that do look very ritualized, and which look very very frustrating to us. But I think sort of there's we often kind of look at things like these gifts, look at these things like these gift exchanges, and get frustrated because we want to see the real business here. We want to see the real negotiation happening. We want to see the real, and I think one of the things I've found very interesting has been looking at work on and you'll know more about this than me, but thinking about China in the pre-modern world, and its relations with neighbors like Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and these thinking about and these are relations which often look like simple gift giving, tribute acceptance, handing out of it, but actually are really serious. They're a cover for, well, not cover, but they constitute actually a very serious set of relationships by which the various policies involved indicate that they recognize each other, that they're part of the same system, that they understand each other, and that this is and that this is a space where where business and work can take place between them, and it's one of the things I often find quite interesting is thinking about gifts between the Carolingians and the Umayyads, where these gifts really do sort of combine with questions of war and peace, for example. So one of my favorite incidents happens in 865, when both Charlemagne's grandson Charles the Bald and the Umayyad Emir Muhammad I both have quite strong reasons to want good relations with each other. Charles is having to fight both his own family and all the Vikings. Muhammad has faced a setback in his campaigning in northern Spain, so they both want peace. So they send envoys to each other, hammering out a peace treaty. It's a real peace treaty to work out, like, we're not going to attack each other, which is sealed when the Emir Muhammad sends Charles a herd of camels, which it's that one of, I mean, I'm not entirely sure how I'd respond if someone sent me a herd of camels, but Charles was apparently thrilled, and I guess, but the gifts themselves kind of constitute that peace agreement, and that kind of gets very much to the heart of that process.
One just small aside that strikes me as interesting. I was just walking over here past in the center of Cambridge, the Fitzwilliam Museum, which on the fence outside, the iron fence, has these interesting depictions of pineapples. And as do a lot of places actually in England and elsewhere around Europe from that time period. And presumably these were made by people who hadn't really seen pineapples, much less really experienced cultivating them or eating them, because they usually don't look much like what we think pineapples usually look like. And so what I wonder is, would Charlemagne, for example, ever have seen animals like elephants or camels before receiving them from these foreign rulers? In other words, could he even be fooled? I'm sending you an elephant, and I just send you an anteater or some other ridiculous thing like this.
Absolutely. It's like it's well, I say it's I saw somebody, it shows up and it's like, well, it's smaller than I was expecting, and it's like, oh well, these stories always, well, I mean, so on the one hand, Charlemagne probably hadn't seen an elephant before. So people at his court would have gone on pilgrimage to the Holy Land before, so they probably encountered camels. He may also have seen there are statues of elephants, including a lot of ones from the ancient period and late antiquity in places like Rome and Ravenna that we know that he visited. So he may have seen a relatively good statue of them. And there's also a tradition of illustrated bestiaries, and you get some really funky looking elephants. We also get ones which look quite good. But my favorite detail here, however, is there's a wonderful account from a couple of decades later, about 825, by this Irish monk he's writing a geography of the world, and he gets to the point where he talks about animals from India, and he's drawing very heavily on classical material. He's kind of a lot of it's cribbed from Roman writers, but he stopped short at one point, and he said, well, the ancients, they tell us that elephants have no knees. They cannot bend their legs. If they fall over, they're done. But we all know this is not true, because we saw Charlemagne's elephant, and that elephant had knees. Apart from this, I don't like this animal bringing genuine kind of updating their knowledge on the basis of seeing that. I do have a wonderful image of these the people transporting this elephant, saying, oh, these Franks are going to be so impressed by this elephant. It's so big, so strong. It's got teeth made of ivory. They're going to be, oh yes, look there. So Ahmed, why are they pointing at his knees? Why are they so excited? Yes, the elephant has knees. Why are they jumping around? Like, what's wrong with you? And I just have this sort of mental image of kind of the Franks going absolutely bananas because this elephant had knees.
That's really interesting, actually, to think about. Well, there are two other questions that I'm going to combine because I think they fit really well together. And then we've been going for an hour, so if we need to stop, you can stop. We can stop after this. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep going a bit longer if you are, and if the audience is still interested. But the two that I'll combine would be there's a question about sort of subnational diplomacy, right? So how much would rulers be concerned about sort of vassals or subordinates interacting with one another across sort of imperial boundaries or national boundaries, and how much would they actually be reaching out to vassals in the opposite polity? So would Charlemagne talk to people subordinate to the caliph or someone else like this. And similarly then, another question asks about non-state actors, right? And so if we think about diplomacy and geopolitics of non-state actors, anything from terrorist organizations, tech companies, multinational corporations, banking firms, et cetera, or other kinds of non-state, the church, for example, could be a non-state actor, although it's also a state actor, particularly at that time. Were there attempts to reach out to non-state actors and dealings between national leaders and non-state actors or kings and non-state actors?
Absolutely. So one of the things I find most fascinating, for example, about the relationship between the Carolingians and the Umayyads is there's very much this they share a border, but it's in many ways more of a frontier. This is it's territory with a lot of very powerful independent leading figures who are often fairly fairly autonomous and fairly and not inclined to follow kind of to follow the lead of people on the other side. So for example, we get rulers doing this. So in the first decades of the 9th century, the Carolingians go very much on the offensive, launching and partly that's Frankish armies marching to Spain, but they also construct an alliance of rebels against the Umayyads. So they sponsor the rebellious uncle of the Umayyad dynasty, but they also ally with a number of rebellious figures in the frontier and effectively attempt to use them in order to kind of undermine the Umayyads. And it doesn't entirely work, partly because the Carolingians and these actors, their interests don't necessarily line up. These Muslim figures on the frontier are rebelling because they want more autonomy, and they're not necessarily they'll take Frankish help if they can get it, but they're not there to be they're not that interested in becoming loyal vassals of Charlemagne anytime soon. So these coalitions tend to collapse, particularly once these border figures start fighting each other. And this also goes the other way. So the Umayyad rulers ally with Frankish warlords on the frontier, and they take advantage of disputed successions and inheritance issues to really wedge their way in there. But also these figures are quite I find it quite easy sort of to cut deals amongst each other. So the classic example is one of the most powerful families on the frontier is family known as the Banu Qasi, who are a family of Muslim Goths. And at their height, the greatest leader is Musa bin Musa, is known as the third king of Spain. He becomes so powerful. But that family heavily intermarries with the Christian Basque dynasty who run the city of Pamplona, which is eventually turns into the later kingdom of Navarre. And the family intermarries a lot of times. They're very fiercely loyal to each other, and they support each other when the other side rebels against the Carolingians or the Umayyads. So there's a lot of scope for that kind of activity, and both the Carolingians and the Umayyads really need to pay attention to it. They need to keep track of it, and they need to pay attention to who's who and who's doing what. And when they mismanage it, it can cause very severe crises. But also I love the reference to non-state actors, because I think this is one thing that I think helps make the early medieval world make sense. Because there are a lot of policies I think are meaningfully described as states, but there's also a lot of people operating who calling them states just doesn't make any sense. And the classic example, that I was thinking about is something like the Vikings. And in the later Viking period, particularly the late 10th century, the 11th century, we see Viking fleets that are effectively national armies. The armies of the King of Norway or the King of Denmark and so on. But in the 9th century, these are actually mostly sort of their own operations, and they're often operations that can be extremely large, with hundreds of ships, thousands of men. And that can be an operation for over the course of decades. So we can track particular fleets to go moving between sort of Britain, France, Spain, follow those movements along. and I think it doesn't make any sense to think of them as a state, but they're certainly political actors, and they can be bargained with, and we see Carolingian rulers strike deals with them. So the most famous example being, for example, between Charles the Simple and Rollo that leads to the formation of Normandy, where he gives them Normandy to settle. But also Carolingians are quite fond of. Carolingians don't always get on well with each other. They have a tendency to fight among themselves, and it's not uncommon for Carolingians to cut deals with different Viking armies and sick them on their own brothers. So, and I look at that and I think there's both something analogous to, for example, pirates of the 17th and 18th century, but also perhaps to our own contemporary terrorist organizations, the way in which great powers will work with them and sort of support them and fund them, while also the fairly mobile, and quite dangerous operations that through recruiting new people can operate fairly autonomously for an extended period of time. There's also obviously the church, which has its own successes nowadays, and we can think about how does the Pope operates in our own contemporary worlds, but also as what has its own flavor within the early medieval world. And Charlemagne talking to the Patriarch of Jerusalem, for example, the Patriarch of Jerusalem he's not in charge of the state, but he is most certainly negotiating on behalf of his community in ways with quite important political and financial implications.
This is really interesting to think about from several angles, all of this. I mean, one would be, to what extent is there a generic problem of states trying to work with, sort of potentially rebellious subnational actors in other states against their enemy, which is in power in the state capital or the state center. I mean, what immediately came to mind when you were talking about that were, for example, the efforts by the United States in what are now Laos, Cambodia, and parts of Vietnam during the 1960s and 70s to work with groups there that were not big fans of the state building projects of those countries post-colonially, and that really wanted greater autonomy, that were not actually seeking specifically to overthrow this government or this party or something like this, but really just wanted greater autonomy for themselves, and the frustrations that they had in working with the United States and that the United States had in trying to work with them.
I know sort of some of my colleagues have got a lot out of reading the works of, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, Pekka Hemalainen, and his work on the Comanche and the Lakota, and sort of thinking about how their interactions with Mexico and the United States are interesting for us for thinking about, not because the Lakota and the Comanche are in some way primitive, but simply as a way of thinking about how do sort of powerful political operations, which are they states? Are they not states? But they can certainly be plausibly described as empires. And how do they interact with kind of these things in ways that have been quite fruitful for thinking about sort of for at least opening our eyes to other possibilities of interactions.
Sure. I mean, there can be instances of dumb luck as well, such as Cortez showing up at the moment that the Aztecs had been just coming out of this period of intense civil war and rebellion. Let's see. There are one or two other audience questions. Actually, the terrorist organization thing also strikes me as extremely interesting as an idea that there could be parallels from some aspects of this period and what we look at today and the relationship between. I mean, one aspect of it, I think, is states sponsoring, condoning, or working with what we identify as terrorist organizations. Another would be states trying to combat terrorist organizations that then become enmeshed and embroiled in conflict with other states. If we look, for example, at what's going on now in Lebanon and the Israeli action to combat Hezbollah, which they identify at least and fairly strongly so as being linked quite closely to Iran, but it mounts now to Israeli military action against Lebanon. So the state, the non-state, and the state behind
Absolutely.
the non-state actor all become enmeshed in this much more complicated set of relations, maybe in a
Absolutely.
similar
I
way.
mean, you know, which puts me in mind. There's a fascinating thing with shortly after the Paris is sacked by a Viking leader called Ragnar, who may or may not be same as Ragnar Lothbrok, recently who was recently in the TV show Vikings, but they had so he sacks Paris, and we have the account of a Frankish envoy who goes to the kingdom of the Danes, and he reports this very awkward situation where so Ragnar and his men are staying in Denmark. They're they're being hosted by the king of the Danes, and yet it's very like the king of the Danes has no kind of responsibility for this attack, and there's a lot of tension between the king of the Danes and there's a real diplomatic question of like to what extent can we hold the king of the Danes responsible for the actions of the but what are we going and the whole thing then gets solved when a horrible disease swoops down and and Ragnar dies a very horrible which kind of lets a lot of people off the hook there.
Right.
But there's a and I look at that and I can't help thinking there's something about that relationship between say Hezbollah and the Lebanese state there is that slightly kind of uncomfortable sort of relationship of a group that is potentially useful but also dangerous, but also sort of and also brings brings trouble with it.
Well, and even just this question of to what extent is the patron responsible for the actions of the client when the client is not clearly a part of the patron state, or of that same entity, right? So it becomes very difficult to identify, right? Who is actually the actor most at fault for particular actions, or who should be attacked or punished. One other audience question that I do want to get to before we really do run out of time, which is this one takes you a bit further afield and says, I wonder if your assessment on the power, what your assessment might be, I guess, on the power of the Medici family. So moving forward 600 years. And their key tools in diplomacy, for example, patronage of the arts. Can we learn something about modern politics and elaborate on this? And so I guess one way would be to look at actually the Medici, if you wish. Another would be to think about Charlemagne and the Caliph and so on. Are they actually engaging in this kind of symbolic diplomacy of patronage in arts? Or cultivation of arts or of study or learning, things like this, or Byzantine as well would be taking this.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think certainly like cultural competitions are very much in play, and like and in many ways, sort of a place like Byzantium and the Caliphate have something of an advantage here. So Byzantium, for example, has Constantinople, and that's with and places like Hagia Sophia, and that there's the famous story of the Rus, coming down to Constantinople, coming into Hagia Sophia, and just being utterly overwhelmed, so that they did not know whether they were in heaven or earth. And that's a sort of staging you can do, and and the Byzantines are very fond of sending mechanical wonders, like clocks or overwhelming audiences with moving mechanical mechanical devices. But there's also a huge cultural component of that. So the Byzantines are very fond also of sending books as gifts, particularly like with what we might think of as scientific knowledge, so like herbal knowledge, medical knowledge, and the Caliphate also very much gets involved in this kind of cultural display. And I think we also see some of the Franks doing something similar. So Charlemagne is quite keen to send books as gifts, and that and there's a real these are lavishly illustrated things, but it's a demonstration of learning, it's a demonstration of culture that and what he built at Aachen. And if you ever have the opportunity, I would encourage anyone sort of to visit Aachen to sort of see the chapel there, which is quite extraordinary and really does clearly draw upon models of building from elsewhere. So there is a great concern sort of creates I think art display these are vital ways that vital parts of the way these dynasties communicate who they are, what they're doing, what they're up to. There's a Charles the Bald sends Pope John VIII a really fabulous ivory throne covered in ivory plates with depictions of animals and classical and classical images, which is so celebrated it starts references to it start showing up in Arabic sources because it's so spectacular. So this is a real kind of cultural kind of, and indeed Charles the Bald has been compared to a Medici prince. Like there's an article that describes him as a Renaissance prince in his kind of his cultural style.
That's quite interesting. I think that pretty much does it. There's one other audience question that just came in about China's great power status in this period, which China would be the Tang Dynasty. My guess is there's really no connection, particularly between the Tang Dynasty and the part of the world we've been talking about.
Well, I mean, yes, and then again, sort of no. And I kind of so I mean, not really with the Frankish world. They're sort of but so but one of the things I find fascinating is that the Abbasid caliphs who talk most with the Franks. This is Al-Mansur and Rashid are also the ones who send a lot of embassies to China. And again, I think there is a bit of a similar developments in play. So we're here mostly dependent upon Chinese records like the old Tang history and so on. But they make references to ambassadors from the Abbasids showing up, bringing gifts, receiving gifts, coming back, and there's one particularly stroppy group who get into a fight with a Uyghur delegation about who gets to go first. And it's often been argued this is all about an alliance against Tibet, and there's maybe something to that, and but in the 780s, something. But I think actually, when we look at it, the Abbasids are in the same situation they were the French, but the Tang dynasty are just coming off the Anushan rebellion, and this great cataclysmic rebellion that almost destroys the dynasty as a whole, certainly rattles their confidence, breaks a lot of their power in Central Asia, and I can't help thinking that in that context, a bunch of embassies showing up from this great Islamic empire would be very much welcomed again in that similar sort of context as a confidence builder, sort of we're still in the game, other people still recognize us as one of the great powers, even despite this crisis. So I think in many ways this is we can actually sort of stretch our view and look across Eurasia when we think about this.
That's a really interesting point, actually. I mean, usually I think of the Tang as trying to build and consolidate an empire more or less at home, right? I mean, the area that they effectively controlled for most of the dynasty was really considerably smaller than what we think of as China today. And a great deal of what they accomplish is, in fact, building a denser state rather than a more expansive one, right? So they don't conquer half the world or expand Chinese boundaries to the maximum extent, but they really do build a lot of what we associate later with the sort of hallmarks of the bureaucracy and the institutional and administrative apparatus of the Chinese state quite successfully. But yeah, that's really interesting that they would also be using those embassies as sort of prestige markers at home, as well as locally, to say, look, stop your rebellions because we're actually better than you think, because these distant empires don't recognize us as important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is this is one of the things I find fascinating, though, is the way in which very different places can kind of come to a shared understanding, and perhaps in a slightly different vein. One of my favorite kind of examples of this is how do these different places, because one of the fundamentals of diplomacy is envoys have to be sacrosanct, more or less. Like you can't conduct diplomacy unless your messengers can get through that. Unless your ambassadors are safe. And there are some edge rules here. If one of them draws a knife on the king, but what I find fascinating is the way these different places kind of come to that same point via different means of legitimization. So in the Carolingian world, for example, they draw on Roman law. The jus gentium is envoys are sacrosanct, and it's very much they cite Roman law, they cite the law of nations. Whereas in the Islamic world, what they often tend to cite is hadith from the Prophet Muhammad, where kind of the Prophet Muhammad very much clear you don't touch envoys, and there's stories of these horribly insulting envoys coming up to Muhammad and Muhammad basically saying, if it wasn't for the fact that you're an envoy, I'd have your head, but because you're an envoy, I can't. You're untouchable. and both those take you to the same place, but you're using slightly different kind of packages of sort of in order to get you to the place you need.
Wonderful. So at this point, we really are long over time. I'll just invite you if you want to say anything else that you haven't gotten a chance to, or that you really like to highlight in conclusion.
I mean, I'd like to thank you for for inviting me to talk. I'd like to thank all the audience for their wonderful questions and for and for being here. And it's always an absolute thrill. So I think I have one of the best jobs in the world, which I get I get to talk about this wonderful, fascinating period and these extraordinary people, and it's always an absolute pleasure to be able to talk more about them.
Thank you very, very much. It's been a tremendous pleasure to have you, and I've learned a great deal from your talk and our conversation. I'm sure the audience has as well, many of whom have stayed with us, even though we've gone long over time. So thank you again very much, and good afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you.